And now, for the first session, I would like to invite the chairperson, Dr. Prashna, Dr. Ritu Arora, and Dr. Kumar Basa. May I request the chairpersons to please switch on the camera and unmute the mic. Thank you so much. Over to the chairperson.
Hi. Good morning, and we welcome you to the first session where the opening batsman for the AIOS is Aishala. And I have Dr. Basak here with me. I can't see Dr. Prajna here, but maybe he'll be joining us. So we start our session with the first speaker being Dr. Deepati Meda, who's going to run us through the slit lamp intricacies. And time allotted to every speaker is 15 minutes. So I will request everybody to please stick to the time and maybe finish a minute or two earlier so that we can have some discussion at the end of every speaker. Over to you, Dr. Deepti, please.
So just to introduce Dr. Deepti here. So Dr. Deepti is a consultant at Karthik Nethralaya in Bangalore, and she has a comprehensive approach and is an all-rounder with a special interest in cornea and cataract. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Ritu, and thank you. My privilege and honor to be the opening batsman for AIOC 2021. So today through this talk, through this next 15 minutes, I'll try to tell you a few important pearls which I follow in corneal drawing and slit lamp evaluation. And corneal drawing is not new to us. This is a beautiful illustration way back in 1973, where our super seniors have been using corneal diagram to treat their patients. And this says it all. I think how much ever you write in your case sheet, a simple small drawing which is quick, a picture can really say worth 1,000 words. So why do we need to draw the cornea or the pathologies? Basically for our clinical judgments to follow up cases. Today, extremely important in terms of medical legality and treatment. You really can't remember the smallest findings of all your patients, so a small diagram would really help. And when you have a team which is co-managing corneal pathology, and believe me, I feel the biggest advantage is to improve your skill sets. So as a resident or a fellow, I remember I would say, okay, let me see the entire cornea. I'm not going to come back. I'll see everything and go and draw, but at least 5 times I come back to look at the smaller intricacies in the ulcer or the depth of things. So I think it's tremendously helped all of us improve our slit lamp skills and give a keen eye to look into anything, maybe erosion or corneal ulcer. So basically there are 6 prime colors which we use when we draw the cornea. The first and foremost being black. So black is used to draw the margin of your cornea, as well as most importantly to denote your corneal scars. So there are a lot of ways in which you can use this blackish or gray color. So I put in 2 scars here. The first one is quite a well circumscribed and second one is quite ill-defined margin. So the same can be depicting when you neatly draw a well-defined margin or you just blur out the margins. And in the second diagram, there is quite a thick leukomatous scar, and then there is a macular nebular gray scar as well. So that also can be depicted by the strength in which you press the pencil on, and different shades of grays can also give you an indirect picture as to how dense the scar is. Again, another common thing, black is used for your corneal sutures, and this is a cyanoacrylate glue which I've used to seal up a perf, and again that is black in color. And this was an interesting case. This was a villager. Vaguely, she says 2 years back she had a surgery and never went back to the doctor. So she had this contact lens with a typical call as jelly bump deposits. 2 years afterwards, she came to us, and that was fascinating. Fortunately, there was no infection. So this is how you put in your contact lens or BCL outline with a dotted line. Again, you have all your spheroidal degenerations and dystrophies can go in black, and corneal nerves, the work striae and intraocular lens again goes in black. Now, brown, there's not a big utility. It's mostly for pigments and iris. So here I've denoted an iris prolapse and Flesher's ring, iris nodules, etc. Blue is basically flow fluid. So you can have different types of fluid collection, maybe a stromal edema where you just color the area. You can have Descemet's folds as in lines, and small circles can denote a microcystic edema. So this is a patient with a disciform herpetic keratitis, where I've denoted the DM folds and the stromal edema, and also such areas where you want to show the depth. It's important to do a cross section like this and show how deep is your edema or your DM folds. Again, an interesting case of a bee stinger with surrounding stromal edema, same shown in the radial blue lines. Now red, as it says, mostly all your corneal and conjunctival blood vessels go in red. So if you want to denote a ghost vessel, you can show it in dotted lines. A corneal deep vessel starts from the corneal margin, whereas a conjunctival vessel, you start drawing from the conjunctiva. So this is a patient with pythium keratitis, and look at the intense corneal vessels in the superior part, which I've denoted here. And the central area is a little thinned out. You can show it in a black or gray shade. And same in a cross section, you can show the 10% thinning by a bump or a dimple in the anterior corneal surface. Again, here what I've shown is a hypopyon. So what I've drawn here is a hypopyon in the end phase diagram, which is ideally wrong. You should not be drawing here. And even if you draw here, just put a mark and say this is a hypopyon. Ideally, the hypopyon is shown in the cross-section view. So here, if you write your colleague to next day may feel this is another infiltrate. So make sure the hypopyon goes in the slit diagram. So this is a day one post-op where there is blood seepage into the anterior chamber, and that can beautifully be denoted by a slit diagram. Again, all your pterygiums and symblepharon go in red. This is a beautiful case. It's a double staining with herpetic ulcer. The entire lower lid, lower part of 1/3 had a lot of rose bengal staining. So rose bengal again can be beautifully shown with a red diagram. And all your follicles and papillae again are red. Now, green, as the color says, is basically for anything which takes up fluorescence. So it can be a filament, it can be an epidefect, it can be an infiltrate. So when you write an infiltrate, it is nice to put the infiltrate in yellow and the margin can go in green just to show that is the beginning of your epidefect. And you can have your SPKs and PEE. So this, I'm sure all of us know, it's a giveaway pattern aberration. So as soon as you see this aberration, just look at the subtarsal, you will find this foreign body sitting there. Again, the green helps you in showing the aberrations. This is a patient with toxic keratitis. So there are a lot of SPKs, and that appears like a epidefect, but actually it is a dense SPK. And this was a patient who developed it after a face mask with Sitafal seed. So that is again a common presentation this part of the world. Now, yellow, as it says, is basically pus or infiltrate. And again, in ulcer, it's very important you show the depth. So here a cross section, I've shown it is just around 10% of the cornea, and hypopyon, I've shown it in the anterior chamber. Again, play with the intensity of your shading. So this ulcer has different intensities of infiltration. So you can show the same with a darker and lighter shade of yellow. So this is the major gist of it. A lot of smaller things are there, but tough in the scope. But this covers at least 95% of your corneal drawing. So in the beginning, I think you can have a simple picture like this, put it in your OPD, and it's very useful for quick reference. So I end the first part with this few tips. Always have a frontal as well as a slit view. So if you see here, this looks like a post graft, but actually this patient has had a graft and a dissect that is shown in the OCT. So that can never be shown in a frontal diagram. Always make a slit diagram where you can show the dissect lentitude. And always have a number to it, either paracentral peripheral or clockwise, you can say prolapse from 7 to 10. And always anterior chamber details should not be shown in the corneal diagram, but always on the slit diagram. Use your intensity, use your drawing skills to improve your shading so that you can actually shade dark and light as per the pathology. Measurements, again, extremely important, especially when you're following up ulcer, etc. So always have the largest diameter of the ulcer and the perpendicular diameter or any other diameter or any other measurements you want, but denote it properly in the diagram. Again, of hypopyon is very important because that is a sign which will help you in follow-up. And always mark the site where you have taken the slit from. So that way you will understand where exactly is the thinning and how much it is. And thinning, again, always show it in percentage. Now, all said and done, corneal diagrams is an excellent tool in the beginning of your career, but I think eventually we all have to settle into digital photographies and things which are even more simpler to use. And today you have a lot of mounts for your basic smartphones. So I'm sure every resident and fellow can start doing this very early in practice. So today is the good fortunate era of digital. So this brings me to the second part where I'll be telling a few pearls on slit lamp evaluation. So not much, but I think there are two basic types of slit lamp all of us know, the tower or the hack street or the good old gold standard or the lower light or the Zeiss type. Now I won't go into technicality, but basically the system can be divided into an observation system, illumination and mechanical. So for practical point, I would say this is the observation system and illumination, they move around the pivot. So this moment is extremely important as I go through the presentation. So these are the various parts available in any textbook. So when you look at, this is a typical figure you would again see in any textbook, and these are the around 9 to 10 types of illuminations that are possible with a slit lamp. So all these can be adjusted by mainly making 3 adjustments. So if I can so first adjustment is how the angle between your illumination and the viewing system are. The second being the size. So you can adjust the slit either vertically or horizontally. So this is another modification you can do to achieve the illumination. And the third thing is magnification. So by a combination of these 3, we can easily achieve all these 10 types of illuminations. So instead of in a monotonous way going for each, I would just run you through a few clinical pictures, and I'll tell you what illumination and what mechanics or what technique I have used to achieve them. So that makes it a little more interesting and practical. So this is a large conjunctival, probably pyogenic granuloma. So here I've used a diffuse illumination and the lowest magnification possible in my slit lamp, that was 10x. And I've kept the illumination slightly at an angle so that I get a better view. So we can use a diffuser. I don't have it on my slit lamp, but giving a diffuser will give it a more diffused illumination. So again, a very diffuse illumination of the entire anterior surface shows a postcorneal scarring, which I done for a patient with leukocoria with PL negative. Then this is again a silicone oil in the anterior chamber, a band keratopathy, again a very low magnification entire area. And this is a patient with an extensive fungal ulcer, and he still preserves the wheat husk which caused it. So as you say in these images, a diffuse illumination will help you to create an overall survey before you start looking into each pathology cleanly. Now, next you look into your slits. So basically, as this image shows, an optical slit shows you the profile or shape of the cornea. So especially when you want to dissect the layers, epithelium, stoma, endothelium, optical section is the best. So keep your magnification decently good. And once you know the pathology, you can increase it further. Keep an angle of 30 to 50 degree. And most important, keep a very thin slit of just around 0.1 mm. So extremely useful for corneal surgeons, where you can actually see or dissect lenticule, where you can see the small DM detachment, and invaluable tool for management of your ulcers, looking at the depth of the scars, etc. Now, when you make this optical section a little wider, say around 1.5 to 2, you start seeing the structures a little better in the perception of depth. So this is a nuclear sclerosis, and this is called as a parallelopiped illumination. Now here I have an angle of 30 degrees between the illumination and my viewing. But when I bring my illumination closer, voila, this is how beautiful the same lesion looks. And this is actually a macro lens vacuole. And this sort of illumination is called as a retro illumination. So again, here you keep your illumination and the observation very close, maybe 10 degrees apart, and the slit can be around 1.5 to 2. So the main idea here is to illuminate either the iris or the retina, and the light which is reflected from there makes your pathology observe more well. So extensively useful for looking at your PCOS, and also for small corneal issues, like this is a patient with a basement membrane dystrophy. So how beautifully these refractile structures look on the retroillumination. Again, an invaluable tool for a refractive surgeon when you look at this pathology, which is the ingrowth of epithelium. So in a direct view, and look how beautifully each nest can be seen when you go into a retroillumination. So again, retro can be divided into a direct retro and indirect retro, where direct is looking at the pathology exactly at the light, and indirect is where you look at it just next to the light. So for most of the corneal lesions, indirect retro work beautifully. Again, for small things like a small foreign body or a filament, this is an iris retro, where the light is falling on the iris and the light reflected from the iris is illuminating this bee stinger. So again, a DM detachment at the incision, and look how we can play with the illumination. So this is, I'm putting light on this part of the fold. This is going to the iris, and from the iris, I'm getting a reflection which is illuminating this part of the DM detachment. So both the illuminations well seen in this picture. So next we go to the sclerotic scatter, again extremely useful for small corneal pathologies. So the idea is to illuminate part of the limbus, maybe around 9 o'clock, which is easy. And there is a phenomenon of total internal reflection. So once this happens, the smaller lesions are seen extremely well. So I quickly go to the specular microscopy. Now, I think these 5 tips are very important to how to achieve an endothelial specular microscopy. So first you go make an optical section and move the optical section so that you get this bright epithelial reflection. So this is your epithelial specular. So once this is achieved, you shift your focus to the endothelium, broaden the beam, and then you can magnify the endothelium. So this way, easily even a resident or a fellow can easily look at the endothelium. So it's just mind-boggling to look at your gut. So you can use these filters, the red-free filter, again to intensify your blood vessels. Then you have the cobalt blue filter here, looking very pristine looking cornea, but as soon as I put him on fluorescent and cobalt, I see this inferior SP case, which is a nocturnal lag of thermos. Again, I just see this lesion on a bright white light, and with the cobalt, I see how this OSSN has spread onto the cornea. So extremely important filter. So I ended with this case, which I actually saw yesterday and added into the presentation last moment. So this was a patient who had mild irritation. The cornea looks pristine, but as soon as I put cobalt blue, this lesion banks on, and this is with a yellow filter called a Ratten filter. So this is a patient who had a recurrent corneal erosion yesterday morning, and within half an hour it's healed. So if not for the knowledge of this and the slit lamp skills, we would have never picked it up, because this lesion goes off in another 2 to 3 hours and we won't be able to see this negative staining. So I think as ophthalmologists, we are extremely privileged and fortunate to actually see the disease in progress. I don't think any specialty God has given a transparent organ, so we can beautifully look at the pathogenesis, enjoy the way the lesion goes. So I thank you. And stop it with this slide where I could beautifully capture the lice, which is having its blood meal, and see how beautifully the blood passes through its body. So thanks one and all. And
thank you so much, Dr. Dipti. It was really a treat listening to you. Moving on to our next speaker, I would like to invite Dr. Rashmi Deshmukh. I request Dr. Rashmi Deshmukh to please start sharing the screen, switch on the camera, and unmute the mic. Thank you so much.
So a little something about Dr. Rashmi Deshmukh. She's a gold medalist from JIPMER, and she finished her fellowship from Narayana Nethralaya in Cornea, and then went ahead to get trained under the guidance of Dr. Dua, and has been a part of Cambridge University currently. And so she is also an example for all of us to be an avid researcher as she is.
thanks, Rolika. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. So I'll be speaking to you guys about corneal topography.
Hello?
So to begin with, we just need to see what is the difference between a topography and a tomography. So a topography is a two-dimensional representation of the anterior corneal surface. So it is not giving you a three-dimensional picture, which you get in a tomography, which is the basic difference between the two. Sorry about this. Yes, so the basic techniques for topography are either a Placido disc-based topography, or a scanning slit beam-based topography, or an elevation-based topography. These are the three basic techniques which are used. So first, starting with Placido disc-based topography, we all have seen a Placido disc. So basically what happens is the concentric rings with the help of a keratoscope are reflected on the anterior surface of cornea. And then the device captures the image of the reflected Placido disc rings from the anterior corneal surface, and then calculates the topographic data and gives a map. So there are certain disadvantages of the Placido disc system. Like if you see in this particular image, there is usually a limited coverage of the cornea. You do not get adequate information about the peripheral cornea. Sometimes even if there are some shadows coming from the eyelashes, you don't get accurate measurements there. Because the Placido system takes reflection only from the anterior surface of the cornea, there is absence of information about the posterior surface of the cornea. So it is just a topography. It does not give you a tomographic image if it is a plain Placido system.
If the rings are widely spaced, the small degrees of abnormalities are not easily identifiable. And of course, because it is a reflection-based topography, you need a healthy ocular surface in order to get a Placido-based topography. So then coming to slit scanning elevation topography, this basically combines a projection of the slit as we use in a slit lamp, which shows us from the anterior part of the cornea up to the posterior part of the cornea, along with a reflection of the Placido disc, which is the keratoscopy principle. And this is how it obtains the anterior as well as posterior corneal curvature measurements. So OrbScan is one of the topographies which uses slit scan as well as Placido-based systems, the combination of the two. So there is OrbScan 1, which was the first attempt to study the posterior surface of the cornea. Then came OrbScan 2, in which the Placido disc was incorporated. And now we have OrbScan 2Z, which has an aberrometer as well. It's a Hartmann-Shack aberrometer, which it uses. Then coming to Scheimpflug principle. So in Scheimpflug principle, the optical planes are at an angle with each other. So for example, in a normal film or a normal camera, the picture, that is the object where you are focusing, the lens and the film plane are all parallel to each other or in the same line. But in Scheimpflug principle, the lens is at an angle to the object as well as to the film plane, and this helps in getting a depth of image. So they are not parallel to each other. That is what Scheimpflug principle means, which is commonly used in Pentacam and Galilei these days. So these devices use a highly precise subpixel edge detector for cornea, as well as the anterior chamber edge detection is possible. And the light from the slit image is scattered at the epithelial level, at the stromal level, and at the aqueous and endothelial level as well. And this is how the system calculates the anterior surface of the cornea and the posterior surface of the cornea. So what does Scheimpflug analysis give you? Apart from corneal topographic data and keratometry values, it gives you the corneal power, including the astigmatism and the axis. It gives you pachymetry data regarding the center, the thinnest point of the cornea, the apex, anterior chamber depth. You can also visualize the angles and the lens opacification and lens thickness as well. Now, how are the maps given? The maps are usually represented in the form of color codes, which the standard one used is the Louisiana State University color coded map, in which the cool colors like the violets and blues represent low powers, which correspond to flat curvatures. The greens and the yellows are the colors which are found in normal corneas. And the warm or hot colors like the oranges and the reds represent higher powers, which correspond to steeper curvatures and steeper corneas. So this is an example of a color-coded map. If you look at this, this particular map, the red zones are the steep zones. So you see a symmetric bow tie in the vertical meridian there. And if you look at the periphery, where you can see the greens and the blues, they represent the flat zone. So the cooler colors are for the flat zone, and the red colors or the warmer colors are for the steeper zones. There are two particular scales which are used for color coding. One is an absolute scale and second is a normalized scale. In an absolute scale, there is a fixed color coding system for a particular instrument. So for same dioptric steps, there are always the same colors. And because these steps can be in large increments, you might miss some subtle changes if you're using an absolute scale. Whereas in a normalized scale, there are different scales for each map, which the computer adjusts by itself. So what the computer does it will identify the minimum and the maximum dioptric value of the map and automatically distribute the range of colors within those steps. It has an advantage of showing more topographic details as the increment steps will be assigned to each color, which is smaller. Now coming to curvature maps. So curvature maps give us the curvature of radius of curvature at each point at the cornea. So there are two types of curvature maps. One is axial curvature and one is the tangential curvature map. In axial curvature map, if you look at this particular figure, the white line is the actual cornea and the blue circle is giving you the global curvature of the cornea. So it is missing that tiny elevation on the right-hand side that we are seeing, which is probably an ectasia in the cornea. So an axial curvature map gives a global view of the curvature as a whole. And the disadvantage is that it has a tendency to ignore minor variations in the corneal curvature, which are given by tangential curvature maps. Because in tangential curvature maps, there are tangents which are projected outwards from vertex ring curvature measured along the tangent. And if you look at this particular cornea, you are getting a different radius of curvature here as compared to the one here, as compared to other points. So you're getting a radius of curvature, which is accurately measured at each point. And that is the advantage of tangential curvature map. Now, these are the common topography patterns that we are seeing. A represents a normal cornea, which is steeper in the center, flattens towards the periphery. B is a centrally steep or an astigmatic cornea. C represents superior steepening. D is inferior steepening. E is an irregular cornea, which you might see in cases like corneal scarrings. F is a symmetric bow tie appearance. G is a symmetric bow tie appearance, but a skewed radial axis. In H, you can see an asymmetry. So there is an asymmetric bow tie, but an inferior steepening. I is an asymmetric bow tie with a superior steepening. And in J, there is an asymmetric bow tie with a skewed radial axis of deviation. Then coming to the concept of best fit sphere. So in a best fit sphere, we basically measure the tissue of interest, whether it is elevated or depressed, with reference to a sphere which we have calculated based on the normal population. So if you look at this particular figure, the green represents the reference sphere, which is the best fit sphere, which the computer will calculate. And this is the tissue of interest. So here, the tissue of interest is actually depressed as compared to the best fit sphere. And here it is elevated as compared to the best fit sphere. So this is what gives us the concept of elevation maps. And how are elevation maps shown? If it is close to the best fit sphere, then you get green or yellow colors. If you get warmer colors, then it shows that it is elevated as compared to the BFS. And if it is depressed, then it will be shown in cooler colors. So why this is important? This is important in reading the maps. So for example, a normal cornea is prolate in shape. So it is steep in the center and it is flatter as we go towards the periphery. So there is a central hill because there is an elevation above the best fit sphere. So when you look at the elevation map, you will see a yellow or a warmer color there. And then you will have an annular C because as it is flattening towards the periphery, it goes below the best fit sphere. So you can see a blue zone, which is concentric to the central elevation. And then towards the periphery, again, it is above the best fit sphere. So you see peripheral highlands. That is how a normal cornea appears. And if there is an astigmatic elevation map, like a normal cornea, which is toric, if you look at this particular map, the vertical meridian, if it is steeper, it will go below the best fit sphere. So the steep meridian will lie under the reference sphere and the flat meridian will lie above the reference sphere. And there will be a central saddle where both the lines meet. We all know that with the rule and against the rule, astigmatism is seen on topographies as vertical meridian being more curved with the rule astigmatism, and horizontal meridian is more curved than vertical in against the rule astigmatism. With the rule is more common in younger individuals and in myopes, and in against the rule astigmatism, you see it more commonly in elderly population. Then just a brief note on pentacam interpretation. So there are 4 maps in a pentacam when you're reading a map. One is an anterior sagittal curvature map. Then there is an anterior elevation, posterior elevation, and a pachymetry map. So there are 4 maps which give you most of the data required. Looking at the red flag signs for keratoconus, on anterior elevation map, normally the elevation should be less than 12 microns, and on the posterior map, it should be less than 17 microns. If it is between 12 to 15 microns, then it is considered as a keratoconus suspect. And on posterior elevation map, if it is 17 to 22 microns, then it is a keratoconus suspect. And on the anterior map, an elevation of more than 15, and on the posterior map, an elevation of more than 22 is highly suggestive of keratoconus. So just looking at an example of the red flag signs for a keratoconus on pentacam. So first, if we look at the keratometry values, they're all beyond the normal range and they're quite steep. Then we can see that there is an inferior irregular steepening, a typical teardrop sign, as we say. An anterior elevation of more than 12 microns. I'm not sure if you're seeing on the image, it is around plus 17 and plus 26. A posterior elevation of more than 18. And the important thing is that all these points of elevations and steepening are coinciding and are coinciding with the thinnest point on the cornea as well, with a thin pachymetry. So this is highly suggestive of keratoconus. And then just looking at some examples, this is a pentacam of a normal cornea. If we look at the curvature map, then it is fairly decently distributed keratometry readings. Then on the anterior elevation map, there is not much of an elevation. On the posterior elevation map, again, there is not much of an elevation. So we know that there is no ectasia there. And the corneal thickness map also is fairly okay. So this represents a normal cornea. If we look at this particular pentacam, then we have a symmetric bow tie appearance with steepening in the vertical meridian. There is again no elevation on the anterior map, no elevation on the posterior map. Pachymetry looks okay. So again, we are not worried of ectasia, but this is a steep cornea or an astigmatic cornea with vertical meridian being steeper. Then coming to ectasias, if we look at this particular map, again looking at the curvature map, there is asymmetric bow tie with inferior steepening more than the superior steepening, slight skewing of the radial axis as well. The anterior elevation is definitely there, it's up to plus 32 microns. There is posterior elevation up to plus 80 microns, so we know there is an ectasia. All the points are coinciding with the thinnest point on the cornea, which is around 384. Again, the cornea is thinned and ectatic, so we can say that this is a keratoconic cornea. This is another example of a similar case of keratoconus where the cone is quite inferior. There is anterior elevation, posterior elevation coinciding with the thinnest point on the cornea. So when we have these coinciding points, then we know that the cornea is actually thinning out there and protruding out and forming a cone. Now, this is a typical example where we say a kissing dove sign or a crab claw appearance, which is seen in the curvature map. So this is a typical kissing pigeon sign. There is an elevation on the anterior map and an elevation on the posterior map. We are not picking up much of thinning on the corneal thickness map, and that is because this is a case of pellucid marginal degeneration. In pellucid marginal degeneration, we have an inferior belt of thinning which can extend beyond 8 millimeters as well. And that is why we get an ectasia above the area of thinning, so the area of thinning can be missed sometimes. And my last example of a post laser vision correction where there is a flattening which is seen on the curvature map and the anterior float, but there is no ectasia there, so posterior float is fine. There is thinning because of the laser vision correction. So this is a post refractive surgery case. And finally, just the uses of topography to differentiate normal astigmatism from ectasias, diagnosing the ectasias, and monitoring the progression of these diseases, screening before refractive surgeries to avoid post-LASIK ectasias, and as a supplement to biometry to look at corneal astigmatism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, doctors. As we have only 1 minute to go, we can have a question answer session from any of the audience. You can proceed.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Rashmi. This was a very elucidated talk, and I really commend you for concising such a huge topic into 15 minutes time. And can you also elucidate a little bit more on the role of best fit sphere and the float, which is written on the top of the maps?
Yes, so best fit sphere is usually calculated by the pentacam itself. There is an option that we can adjust it, but mostly it is calculated according to the normal population. Right. Based on the best fit sphere, for example, if it is given as an 8.2 millimeters, so 8.2 millimeters means the radius of curvature of that best fit sphere. And then it will calculate how much float in the sense elevation or depression of the surface that we are looking at. So if there is an 8.2 millimeters radius of curvature, that curve fits into the cornea that we are studying. If your anterior surface of cornea is above that, it will come as plus, say, 12 microns or plus 20 microns, which means this is 20 microns above the normal. If it's minus 20, it will be 20 microns below the normal. So if it is above means we are looking at ectasias if it is beyond the normal range. If it is below, we are looking at a flattened surface.
No, what I was trying to say that when we're interpreting a chart, it's important to look at the dimension of the BFS which is given in the map.
Yes.
Because when we are comparing the two charts, especially when you see a conus or post-cell, so when you have to see whether it has progressed or even refractive surgery maps, so whatever data which we take it over a fixed amount. So suppose there is one is 8 and another is 8.
Yeah, we need to make sure that the best fit sphere.
Suppose I've forgotten to. Yes, that's what I wanted. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of the doctors. I hope you have a very valuable session for Q&A. Now, moving on to the next speaker, I would like to invite Dr. Pooja Kamar. I request Dr. Pooja Kamar to please switch on the camera, unmute the mic, and start sharing the screen. Thank you so much. Over to the chairperson.
What are chairpersons going to do over here?
Ma'am, I'll introduce Dr. Pooja Kumar. So, ma'am is a consultant and lead trainer in cataract and refractive services at Narayani Nethralaya Institute and is actively involved in translational research at GROW and IBMS lab. And her areas of interest include wound healing in refractive surgery, customized lasers for refractive surgery and keratoconus, and with special interest in gene therapy and recent advances. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Rolika. Thank you, Santoshar, and everyone for giving me this opportunity to share a talk on management of corneal ectasia. What I'm going to do is, like, this is for postgraduates. I'm going to be talking about like how you can answer your exam whenever you get a question on keratoconus. So whenever you are talking about corneal ectasia, you need to know what what are the types of corneal ectasia, the prevalence and risk factors, the history, the diagnosis, the medical management, and the surgical management. So my talk is on management. I'll just give a short brief on the first four topics as well. So there are various types of corneal ectasias. Like the most common one is keratoconus, but you also have keratoglobus, Terriens and pellucid marginal degeneration. You have post-keratorefractive ectasia, and you have wound ectasia after penetrating keratoplasties as well. And the prevalence varies according to where you are situated, according to different regions. In our country, it can range from 0.0003% to 2.3%, and it can also go as high as 5.2%. Keratoconus is usually seen in patients in pediatric age group, and it usually progresses until about the age of 40 years. And keratoglobus may be seen in children and may be congenital. Pellucid marginal degeneration is usually seen, and it has an onset in your later ages in life. So what could be the risk factors? There are various risk factors like connective tissue diseases, abnormal retinal function. So it can be also, there are a lot of syndromes if associated with eye rubbing. It can also lead to keratoconus or the progression of disease of corneal ectasias. It can be because of atopic disease, chronic contact lens uses, and post-refractive surgery. Corneal ectasias are usually bilateral, but it can be unilateral also, because one of the eyes can be subclinical, which may not manifest as a disease. It usually results in corneal thinning, irregular astigmatism, and decreased vision. That's what your patients come to you with the complaints. Usually associated with eye rubbing. They might or might not have a family history. They start at a younger age of onset, and greater progression results in severe loss of vision due to greater irregular astigmatism, thinning, and scarring. And there is a chance of corneal hydrops as well, which can occur in 3% of your keratoconus population. And higher the history of or risk history of eye rubbing and seasonal allergies, they are associated with higher risk of development of hydrops. So how do we decide the treatment? Do the patients need treatment, or how do they present to you? It is based on the severity of the disease and the amount of vision loss. And it depends also on how gradually how the symptoms are reducing. Like, is there a gradual progressive diminution of what? The main complaint patients will come to you is like, I have frequent changes in glasses and gradual diminution of vision. That is one of the signs that you're dealing with corneal ectasia. And also the patient outcome criteria depends on maintaining or restoring or improving the visual function. The greater the delay in diagnosis, the higher the risk of vision loss you have, and it might require a corneal transplant as well. So how do you diagnose it? The diagnoses are based on two important points here, which is the history and the examination. History includes the onset and course, the vision, the ocular history, and the medical and family history. In examination, you need to assess the vision. The most important would be scissors reflex. You need to do external examination like your eyelids, slit lamp biomicroscopy of the cornea, intraocular pressure. You need to do fundus examination and diagnostics tests like topography, tomography, what Rashmi has already spoken about, keratometry, and the ASOCTs. This all will help you in diagnosing whether your patient has a disease or not. And these are the tests. I'll not go into deep because I would like to talk more about the management. So what are the management options? This is a beautiful algorithm which was published in IJO, which talks about that when your patient has keratoconus and when your patient walks into your clinic when he has been diagnosed at keratoconus, based on the grade of KC he has, or based on his history, or based on his demographic high risk factors, what would be the type of treatment you would want to give for the patient, whether you would like to observe the patient or whether the patient has progressed, you would like to do cross-linking, which type of cross-linking, whether it would be epi-on, epi-off, or a laser-based cross-linking, or you would like to do an intracorneal ring segment or keratoplasty. So this nomogram beautifully talks about like at what level you will do which type of surgery or management, which I'll be covering in my next slides. So managements are of two types. One would be a medical management. Why medical management? Medical management is like if it's early grade of keratoconus, or there is no history of progression, or there is no history, significant high risk of progression, then you would like to give the patient eyeglasses and keep them on observation and follow them up every 6 months or 1 year, depending on their age and the risk of progression they have. The second would be contact lenses, depending on the type of keratoconus you have. If it's a mild form of keratoconus, if it's not an extremely steep cornea, you can give spherical contact lenses or a toric soft contact lenses if the patient accepts, because it perhaps gives you more comfort than a hard contact lens. But if there is an advanced disease, then you would, or it's a high astigmatism, or it's an irregular cornea, you would consider a gas permeable contact lens, the rigid corneal gas, RGP lenses, which are known as. And the advantage is it masks the corneal irregularities, that it provides a regular anterior refractive surface, giving a better visual outcome. There are various other types of contact lenses. If you have a high power or something, you can give a hybrid contact lens, or you can give a piggyback contact lens, which are the newer generation lenses, but they also have their disadvantages. So you have to gauge that what kind of keratoconus you are dealing with, what grade of keratoconus you are dealing with, and depending on that, you will take a call on what type of contact lens to give or not. The most important and recent ones are the scleral contact lenses, which have a very huge role in management of keratoconus, because it completely vaults the corneal surface to provide centration, stability, and improved central visual acuity. And a study done by Barron et al. Found that all patients referred for scleral contact lenses who failed to have a RGP lenses were successfully fitted with scleral contact lenses, and they could and the most advantage here is you can customize the scleral lenses, and thus you can give a better visual quantity and quality for these patients. For example, even if with glasses the patients are not improving to more than 6/12, you can try a scleral contact lenses for this patient, and this patient can achieve a higher or a better visual quantity and quality. But the disadvantage is that it has decreased your exchange and difficulty with insertion. It's a learning curve for your patients to insert and remove the lenses. So you have to educate your patient extremely well that how to go about it with the scleral contact lenses. And you have to give them a disclaimer that scleral contact lenses or any of the contact lenses are just one sort of visual rehabilitation to improve the visual acuity, and they will not arrest the disease process. So they need to be on regular follow-ups to see whether what the condition of the disease. The other medical management would be to check your Ig levels of the blood. Most of the keratoconus patients are associated with eye rubbing. So even if they don't have any known allergies, or if it's a subclinical allergies which they are not aware of, it will make them rub their eyes, which will lead to the keratoconus disease. So it's extremely important to check their serum Ig levels. And even if it's associated with atopy, ocular allergy, or not associated with it, you need to manage the serum Ig levels along with your keratoconus medical management or surgical management. The other drop is cyclosporin drop 0.05%, which is keratoconus is an inflammatory condition. So it helps in controlling the inflammation, and it helps in stabilizing the disease, which is not always, but yes, if it's an early grade of keratoconus with mild risk of progression, you can always keep the patients on cyclosporin A 0.05%. And other newer drops are Trehalose, Tree halos also reduces the oxidative stress and enhances the autophagy mechanism in the corneal epithelium, thus like having a better health of the corneal epithelial cells, and thus it gives a better outcome in a keratoponic eye. And the newer drop, which is being in clinical trials, is the IV Med 80 drops, which is like a LOX enhancer. It's a copper-based formulation. So it will be like a eye drop therapy to stabilize the progression of the disease and even flatten it. It's like a medical cross-linking, but it's not. It doesn't use riboflavin. It uses the IV Med 80 drop. So these are all the newer therapies which you need to keep in mind when it comes to medical management. Surgical management, the base and the most important surgery is done is the corneal cross-linking. It is designed to increase the biomechanical rigidity of the cornea. It is achieved by local photopolymerization using the UVA light and topical riboflavin as the photosensitizing agent. The aim of cross-linking is to arrest or slow the progression of corneal ectasia in the early diseases, and it's a US FDA approved procedure for patients between 14 to 65 years of age with known history of keratoconus. So there are various types of drops available. The most important which you have to know is 0.01%, 0.1% and 0.2%. They are mixed with either HPMC or dextran-based drops, or they are the hypoosmolar drops. And based on the concentration you are using, you have different protocols like accelerated cross-linking, hypoosmolar riboflavin-based cross-linking, contact lens assisted cross-linking, lenticular assisted cross-linking, pulse cross-linking, or a photo activation of chromophore cross-linking. So these are just the various protocols of like a Dresden protocol. The basic one which you all have to know, which is also known as conventional cross-linking. There you soak the cornea with riboflavin for 30 minutes, where you put 1 drop every 2 minutes, and then you give the fluence for 3 millimoles centimeter square for 30 minutes of irradiation time. The accelerated protocol is the next protocol which all of you need to know, where the soakage time is for 20 minutes, where you put the riboflavin drop every 2 minutes, and then you irradiate the cornea with 9 millivolts per centimeter square for 10 minutes. And these are the other protocols with different energies which you can use, and which are also the accelerated protocols known in the literature. But the most important ones are the conventional cross-linking for 30 minutes and the accelerated cross-linking for 10 minutes. And this is the total energy which is used for our cross-linking. The next would be a topo-guided PRK with cross-linking. If you want to regularize your cornea, if your corneal thickness is more than 450 microns, and if it's an early to moderate disease, you can go ahead with a laser-based cross-linking, which is also known as topo-guided PRK with cross-linking. It is done in patients with poor contact lens fit, who are unhappy with glasses, or they don't tolerate contact lenses, they have mild to moderate disease. You can go ahead and do a topo-guided PRK with cross-linking. The various platforms available are Wavelight, Schwind, and others as well, where you can do it. And also Schwind is one of the other platforms where you can use a topo-guided PRK. So what topo-guided PRK does is it makes your cornea more regular, spheric. So it will give your patients a better, best corrected visual acuity, improved contact lens fit. It will reduce the aberrations for the patients. And it also changes the sphericity of the eye. It centralizes your cone, so that if it's a patient has higher power, in future you can do a phakic IOL for rehab of the cornea. The other procedures we have to know is the topo-guided removal of epithelium in keratoconus, where it just removes around 20 microns more than in the stroma, apart from your epithelium, just on the cone area, and then it's followed by a conventional or a accelerated cross-linking, so that here also you can regularize the cone. This is done when your thickness is less than 450 but more than 400, where you cannot do a topo-guided PRK plus cross-linking. You can also do a PTK-based cross-linking to remove your epithelium, but only it's done when your TCT is less than 450 microns. It's just another way of removing. And I'll just, the other next procedure would be the intracorneal ring segments, which is the INTAX procedure. INTAX procedure is done in cases of decentered cones. There are various types of intracorneal ring segments present, like INTAX and Kera rings. You need to know this is the slide which you need to know, and you need to answer it in your paper if only a question on intacs is asked. And based on the type of the cone, the location of the cone, the corneal thickness and the depth, you need to decide where you'll put the ring, the type of ring you put, and the incision from where you'll put the ring. You can make the incisions and make the channels for intracorneal ring segments along with a manual dissector or femto based channels. And this is just an algorithm of how you decide on the rings which you put. And I'll just skip few slides. If it's a thinner cornea, the only option is available is your keratoplasties. No, now there are newer protocols, like if your corneas are thinner than 400 microns, you can use a customized fluence. Your riboflavin soakage time would be the same, but you can use the customized fluence based on the energy you want to use to cross-link corneas thinner than 400 microns as well. And these are some newer methodologies where they do a flash cross-linking, or they use alphatic beta nitro alcohols for therapeutic cross-linking, or they use cross-linking using the rose Bengal and the green light to increase the corneal stiffness as well. These are not routinely used, but the newer methodologies in your which are available in the literature and done by some of our groups. And a collagen carbon nanotube composed materials can also be used as tissue engineering to use as scaffolds while doing a cross-linking. And the next two techniques, which if the patients are not eligible for any of this procedure, even if not the cross-linking with thin cornea, then you can go ahead and decide whether to do a keratoplasty. The keratoplasties are partial thickness, which are also known as lamellar keratoplasties, which are the deep anterior lamellar keratoplasties, or a crescentric keratoplasties if it's a localized thinning in cases of marginal degeneration, or a keratoplasty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pooja, to summing up on the time. Now, moving on to our next speaker, I would like to invite Dr.
Only 1 second. Would
Kumar
the
Maharana.
chairpersons like to take a discussion regarding the talk, please?
Yeah, provided I'm given a chance.
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
I think we have more muted. Yeah.
Actually, we are running short of time.
No, Tanvi, we are not running short of time. Don't worry.
Okay, fine.
Sure. Yeah. So, Dr. Pooja, I think it's a very long topic. And
I'm sorry, I cannot cover it in 15
I know. It's a very, very long topic, and you just gave an overview, so which is very good to give it in such a short time. And so what would be your main preference if in one line you have to talk about managing, say, keratoconus with thinner cornea, say like somebody has through 370, 380 microns. What would you like to do for that kind of a 20-year-old patient with keratoconus?
For a 20-year-old patient, ma'am, if with a newer protocol, I would like to do a cross-linking with a modified fluence, where you, as I said, you only do, like, your soakage time is going to be either 30 minutes or 20 minutes based on the protocol, or accelerated or a conventional protocol you choose, but the fluence will be modulated depending on the thickness you have. So that would be my first line of management for my patients. But however, I would like to take a special consent for these patients that as we are doing a cross-linking on a thinner cornea, as you are young, there are higher chances of progression that you might progress after this cross-linking as well. And the next step would be keratoplasty. But as it's a transplant, that is not my first line of management, and that's why I'm going ahead with a cross-linking with thinner cornea.
Yeah, so you're moving more and more away from surgery.
Yes, more and more away from transplants, because that would be the last option for all our patients.
So that's the message which I wanted everybody to take. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's go to the next speaker, Dr. Praful.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah.
Dr. Praful on overview of lamellar surgeries.
Okay. So just to introduce Dr. Praful, sir. So he is at RP Center, and he is one of the leading personnel when it comes to the teaching program for postgraduates, and he has written ophthalmology clinics, book 1 and book 2 for everyone's convenience, and he has more than 100 PubMed indexed journals, publications. Sorry. Over to you, sir. So his video is not working, so we'll be delivering his speech over the audio version.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Ritu ma'am. And thank you for that introduction. So I look after postgraduate teaching program at RP Center. So I have a little bit experience of all this postgraduate exam. So lamellar surgery is a very vast topic, and I think anyone from the audiovisual team may help me because I'm not able to share my desktop. I don't know why.
Yes, sir. I will just connect you to the EV team. Just a second. Excuse me, Dr. Prafulla.
Yeah.
I hope it is visible now.
Yes,
I
it
don't
is.
know
At least I can see
if
it.
my
I think
slides
yes.
are visible. If my
Yes.
slides are visible to you.
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yes, sir.
yes, they are
Definitely.
visible to me, Praful.
Yeah.
So it's okay.
Thank
You
you.
can continue.
Thank
Yeah.
you. So corneal lamellar surgery for postgraduate, it can come as a essay type question, or it may, a part of it may come as a short note, or if you have got a long case like keratoconus or PBK or Fuchs dystrophy, then that may be asked in Viva. So I'm not going into the detail of it because 15 minutes will be too less. So whatever the content that is there in my PPT, it's basically from this review article. All these are open access article. You can go through that if you want to know detail about it. So what is a lamellar surgery? Basically, it's a disease-specific corneal layer replacement. I'll just explain with this ASOCT picture. You can see this is an intersegment OCT picture of Rees-Buckler corneal dystrophy. There was enterostromal subepithelial deposit. Instead of removing the entire cornea, what we have done is we have just replaced this anterior part. So we have replaced the digits layer with a normal cornea. So this is what is a lamellar surgery is. So why lamellar surgery? When you have PKP, why not go for that? So there are few advantages of lamellar surgery, and that's why these are the preferred method of replacing diseased cornea nowadays instead of a full thickness graft. So first is decreased risk of graft rejection. You know, the antigenic load with lamellar surgery is less compared to PKP, and that is exactly reflected in the form of reduced rate of graft rejection. And you know, graft rejection is the most common cause of graft failure. So if you want to have a graft survivability which is much longer, then lamellar surgery is preferred. If you just compare the graft rejection rate, these are average rates of rejection. In PKP it's almost 25 to 30, in DAL somewhere around 3 to 5, in DSEC it's 7 to 14, and DMEC it's less than 1%. So this is often asked by few examiners in Viva, so you can remember this figure. So you can see lamellar surgery will lead to a reduced rate of graft rejection. The other important advantage is those who must have seen PKP video, they will be able to know this. The PKP is an open sky procedure, right? You are at one particular stage, your globe is completely open, and the complications like suprachoroidal hemorrhage, all these things can occur, but these complications are not there in lamellar surgeries. Third is one donor, multiple uses. This is very useful in setup like India, where the donor tissue requirement is high, but the supply is a deficit. You can use one donor cornea. You can use the posterior part for posterior lamellar keratoplasty and anterior part for anterior lamellar keratoplasty. Last but important is stable wound. In PKP, if you are posted in emergency services and if you have a cornea transplant services at your center, then you must have noticed few cases of graft dehiscence following trivial trauma. So remember, the normal tensile strength of cornea and the tensile strength that is achieved after suturing the graft is never same. Okay, so your penetrating graft is definitely weaker compared to a normal cornea. So with trivial trauma, there could be dehiscence. Dehiscence can occur following lamellar also. However, the tensile strength is relatively better in lamellar keratoplasty. So which are the different type of lamellar surgeries are there? So you can classify in two ways. One either anterior posterior, and the other one is depending the layer you are transplanting. Okay. So if you are transplanting the Bowman's layer, then it is called isolated Bowman layer transplant. If you are transplanting the stroma, so this can be classified depending on the depth to which you are removing the host cornea. If you are simply removing the 130 to 150 micron superficial, then we call it SALC. If it is 250 to 350, we call it ALTK, anterior lamellar therapeutic keratoplasty. If you are removing almost 90% depth, then we call it pre-descemetic DALC. If it is complete bearing, then you can call it a descemetic DALC. Endothelium DM complex, you must have heard of this technique, DSEC, DMEC, and PDEC. DSEC is basically endothelium decimate with little bit of stroma. DMEC is only transplantation of the decimate endothelium complex. Okay, PDEC decimate endothelium and with that Duas layer. Okay, so these are the different groups. Easiest way to remember is anterior LK and posterior LK. Anterior LK is stroma and Bowman's membrane. Posterior LK is your decimate and endothelium layer transplant. Okay, Bowman's layer transplant, I haven't done any of this procedure till now. So this is a picture I have taken from the authors of the proponent of the original article, that is Van Dijk et al. They have proposed this technique. The technique is simple. You remove the epithelium, then create a 360-degree gutter using a needle, and then using a blunt forceps, you can peel the Bowman's layer. Then you can create a stromal pocket. Okay, those who have done SICS, then they must be able to appreciate this. You initially create a corneocerebral tunnel, and then using a lamellar dissector, you achieve a mid stromal pocket from limbus to limbus, and then using special injector, you can inject the Bowman's layer and make it flat and make it and you can position it exactly in the mid stroma. This is a picture from the same authors group. This is a 5-year post-operative picture. You can see the Bowman's layer is there in deeper stroma. So the idea behind this technique is Bowman's layer is acellular layer with some tensile strength. So if you transplant Bowman's layer in cases of keratoconus, that will help you in preventing progression of keratoconus and stabilizing the keratometry. The advantage of this technique, you are not using any suture, so the surface is not altered at all. However, the problem is it's a very difficult technique to master, and if you go through the review of literature so far, you can see there are only 5 published reports on this topic. So a technique which is not reproducible, the others could not if other cannot repeat the same technique, then that means there is some problem with the technique. However, whatever study that have been published so far, they have cited good results with this. But one important point that you must notice here is in the hand of the author who have proposed this technique, the risk of decimate perforation is almost 20%. Because if you notice this image here, the dissection from limbus to limbus is a closed procedure. Closed procedure means you are going blind into the cornea, and simply based on the reflex of your air and endothelium, you are doing a mid-stromal dissection. So there is a risk of decimate perforation, which is a major disadvantage with this technique. Next comes your stromal lamellar surgeries. ALTK, SLK, they are almost similar, except the depth to which you are replacing the cornea, and in ALTK you are using suture to fix the graft. In SALK, instead of suture, you are simply using fibrin glue to attach the graft. Indications are similar in both cases. However, depending on the depth of the opacity, you have to choose whether you have to go for SALK or you want to go for ALTK. So the broad indication include corneal dystrophy degeneration, any scar post complications such as refractive procedure, post LASIK scar, or pterygium excision there is a scar, you can go for this technique. Or ocular surface diseases like chemical burn and there is only a superficial haze, then you can go for this technique. Remember, ALTK has also been used as a tectonic graft in cases of corneal ectasia, but SALK till today has not been used as for this indication. These are just few clinical photographs. This is a epithelial base membrane dystrophy. This is a case of spheroidal degeneration. This is SND. This is granular dystrophy. In all these cases, you can go for ALTK or SALK. This is an associative picture of a SALK patient. If you notice here, the depth of the or the thickness of the graft is 310 micron. Similarly, this is an example of a SALK patient. If you see the associative image, the SALK tissue is here, and if you carefully notice the margin, then it is not as good as ALTK. Why? Because in ALTK you are putting suture, so graft host apposition is good. In SALK, since you are using glue only, so the graft host junction may not be that good as like an ALTK. Now, donor preparation for SALK or ALTK as well as DSEC is same. You use an artificial chamber and microkeratome to cut the donor part. You adjust the thickness of the blade depending on your requirement. So this is a short clip showing how it is done. So this is a donor cornea. You mount it on the artificial chamber, and then you choose appropriate size microkeratome head. Okay, this is an IOCT picture. If you have microscope integrated OCT, you can check the thickness of the donor tissue. If you don't have, no need to bother. You can use the ultrasonic pachymeter also. Why it is important? When you are preparing the donor for dissect and you want to achieve a thickness of less than 100 or also known as ultra thin dissect, then you can take the help of this to decide the size of the microkeratome head that you are going to use. However, for SALK and ALTK, the donor thickness is already decided. So you may not need this intraoperative pachymetry at all. So you can see this is a IOCT picture. This is a donor cornea mounted on artificial chamber, and this is a microkeratome head. Here it is 400 microns. So this is primarily a graft preparation for dissect procedure. If it would have been ALTK, it could have been 250 or 300 micron. If it would have been SALK, it would have been 150 to 200 micron. So it's a completely automated procedure. You just press the foot switch and it will go forward and backward. And while going forward, I'll just show you. Okay, you can see this anterior lamella comes out like this. You can pull it out with McPherson or Klim's forceps and use it for interlamellar keratoplasty. Whatever remaining behind, this is the posterior lamella, and this can be used for dissect procedure. So donor preparation is with microkeratome. Post preparation in SALK and post preparation is also with microkeratome. This is an old video and it was a case of anterior corneal scar. You can see 250 micron head is used to cut the disease part. You can see this is the disease cornea that is coming out. Once you have removed the anterior part, the posterior cornea is little bit clear. Then you then you create a margin using a crescent knife. You can create the graft. You can do a pocket. And if it is a ALTK, you apply suture. If it is a SALK, you simply apply fibrin glue and place your graft. Okay, these are just few examples. It was a case of SND with ALTK. The point of showing this image is you just check these are the sutures there. Okay, in SLK, this was a case of post-Lasky scar where SLK was done. You can see there are no suture. Okay, it's just a glue application. And this is an example of ASOC showing a SLK. So what are the advantages of SLK and ALTK? As I said, ALTK has the disadvantage of suture. Other than that, the advantage limits are almost same. In SLK, you are not putting any suture. So visual rehabilitation is early. Okay, and the interface is smooth, surface is smooth. All surface related changes are or problems are not there. But there is a major limitation to SLK and ALTK. You are doing both host and donor preparation using microkeratome. You are not deciding. In manual trephine, you can take any specific size like 8 mm, 9 mm and do a trephination, but this is not there in SALK or ALTK. And remember, when your microkeratome is used, the size of the donor or host cut depends on a lot of factor. Most important is pressure inside the anterior chamber, artificial anterior chamber, and the head you are using, the keratometry. So all these factors decides what is the diameter of your host and donor cut will be. So at times it may happen there your host is 9 mm and you get a donor tissue of 8 mm. So there could be mismatch, and that may lead to some wastage of tissue. And at times you may have to put suture because if the gap is too much, then you have to apply suture. Okay, so ALTK, as I said, it is similar to SLK. Other than that, you have to put sutures here. Now coming to DLK, I'm not going to detail of all the procedure because 15 minutes won't be sufficient. I'm just touching the important points so that will help you in Viva or your theory questions. So DLK types, various authors classify it different way. So you can remember, you can classify it as decimatic and pre-decimatic. Pre-decimatic means you have reached almost 90%. Decimatic means you have bared the stroma till decimate membrane. Okay, so why this pre-decimatic decimatic classification is important? Because remember, in the visual function following DLK depends on the residual stromal bed. How much stroma you are leaving, that decides your visual acuity. There was a study by Arjaman et al. Where they found that if your stromal thickness is less than 20 micron, the quality of vision is as good as penetrating keratoplasty. If it is between 20 to 80, then your final BCVA, whatever you record on Snellen's, will be same as that of PKP, but there will be reduced contrast sensitivity. So contrast will be affected. If your residual stromal bed thickness is more than 80, then both final BCVA as well as contrast sensitivity goes down. This is often asked in Viva. Examiner may ask you So it's if you remember this that will be good for you. So that's why the aim is always reach as close as to Descemet membrane. Indication for both are safe. Any corneal opacity where the endothelium is healthy. Remember this word, the endothelium has to be healthy. If endothelium healthy, you can go for DLK. So the examples are keratoconus or corneal dystrophies, ocular surface diseases, mucopolysaccharidosis or healed keratitis. And remember, so why do we need pre-descemetic then? If descemetic gives you the best quality of vision, then why do we need pre-descemetic? So the answer lies in this RCT by Rafi et al., where they compared Malise, one technique of pre-decimating dark with big bubble dark, and they found that both have similar visual acuity, but contrast sensitivity is poor with pre-decimatic dark. But pre-decimatic dark has an advantage when you are dealing with cases of keratoconus with healed hydrops, or the scar trauma that has involved your endothelium, or it's a case of microbial keratitis that has healed with residual scarring involving Descemet membrane, or in ocular surface disease where you are not sure about the corneal thickness. In all these cases, pre-Descemetic DALK is useful. This is a commonly asked question in Viva, which are the different technique of DALK and who proposed it. So remember, these are the technique. Air assisted was proposed by Archela et al. Big bubble was proposed by Anwar et al. Visco assisted by Malise et al. And hydro delamination is by Sujita et al. So you can remember this name. You may be asking your Viva question. Manual DALK, I'll just how this is done. This is a case of keratoconus with healed hydrops. So do I need to stop here or?
Apologizing totally. Sorry to interrupt, sir. The time is up. I request the moderators to please just come up with the questions if you like to.
Isn't it that we have such a little bit more time because another speaker is not there?
Yes, ma'am.
So you can, we can give him a little bit more time. He can finish it off.
Yes. Okay, ma'am. Okay.
Yes, Dr. Praful, please carry on.
He's taking a nice video. Complete video. It's a manual procedure.
No, sir, please go ahead.
What I want to show you is that you achieve an initial level of dissection with any device like diamond knife or a guarded knife or a Hesburgh-Baron Refine, and using lamellar dissector you can take one layer. If you are not happy with one layer, then you can take more and more layers and completely do the procedure. The aim is to reach as deep as possible. Since this was a case of hydrops, it was a pre-Descemetic DALK was done in this case. Similarly, in big bubble technique, this was a case of macular dystrophy. Sir, initially you created 2/3 depth or 70% depth by a Hesburgh-Baron Refine. Then you create a pocket and inject your air bubble and inject the air to achieve a big bubble. Here I would request you to remember this clip because it will help you in understand later on. I'll show you one slide. Okay, so here you can appreciate there are two types of bubbles are here. Okay, one is central 8 mm, this bubble, and another one, although not complete, little bit extending into periphery. Remember, this first one is known as type 1 bubble, this is known as type 2 bubble. What is this? I'll just show you one animation. So when you are dealing with big bubble DALK, this they may ask you in exam, what are the different types of bubble? So if this is the enterostroma, this red one is your Duas layer which extend around 8.5 mm, all the fiber extend in periphery. This is your Descemet which extend from swell base line to swell base line. Okay, so if you inject air, if it is a type 1 bubble, the detachment will be between Duas layer and stroma. If it is a big bubble formed at or type 2, the bubble has formed between your Descemet and stroma. Okay, so this is the photograph from one of the article by Dua et al. If you have achieved a type 1 bubble near Duas layer, it will be little bit granular, but if it is a type 2, it will be very smooth. So in that picture, in that clip, we had type 2 as well as 1. So that is known as a type 3 bubble. Femto assisted, I am not going to detail of this. Advantage of DLK over PKB, I have already enumerated initially, but remember DLK has its own limitation. Important is interface haze and higher order aberrations. Posterior lamellar keratoplasty, time is not that much, so I'll just show you one clip of dissect how it is done. So donor preparation is already there. The basic concept is using Descemet scoring. You remove the Descemet and disease endothelium. Then you take help of any glide and put the graft inside anterior chamber, and you use air tamponade to let the graft attach to the posterior surface of stroma. Similarly, in DMEC, instead of stroma, we simply replace the descemet membrane only. This is a short clip. This donor preparation, this is basically I have learned from Dr. Basak. You use 2 trephines, 9.5 initially, then make a partial thickness cut, then peel the descemet and pull it up and leave little bit attachment. Then you use a skin trephine to mark it, FP, anything you can mark. Then take appropriate size trephine and cut a DMEC size of 8 or 7.5. This was a case of healed viral keratouveitis, was a phakic patient. So you remove the descemet membrane of the disease cornea and replace it with a donor graft. This was the donor DMEC roll, as you can see. And inserting, you can use any injector like ICL cartridge or IOL cartridge, and you can simply inject it. This is the use of, here I have used a D cartridge of Alcon IQ lens to insert the graft. So the basic difference between DSEC, DMEC, I have already told. In DSEC there is a stroma. So you need a microkeratome. Because of stroma there is interface haze. Because of stroma the visual recovery is delayed and hyperopic shift will be there. These things are not there in DMEC, but the problem with DMEC is you have to practice. You need practice. In early stages, the chances of loss of tissue, graft dislocation, primary graft, all these are quite high. These are just last few slides. This may be asked in Viva question. That's why I put this. They may ask what are the different method of donor insertion in DSEC. Remember, you can use forceps such as Bucin TAN, but they have high endothelial loss. You can use glides like TAN endoglide, Bucin seed glide, endosetter, or you can use this folding or taco technique. In DMEC preparation, which are the different technique? Remember this name scuba, because the author may ask, the examiner may ask you what do you mean scuba. Scuba is a technique where the DMEC tissue preparation is under Optisol or under BSS. Punch and stain is the most commonly followed technique nowadays. I have shown you that picture here. So these are the various insertion device. Remember this inserter goiter. Examiner may ask you, tell me some specific inserter for DMEC. It's a goiter inserter, and this is a preloaded DMEC tissue. Okay, so that is available in Western countries nowadays. Complication, just I'll name the complication. Specific to lamellar procedure, interface haze, commonly seen in DLK 3 to 5%. Usually affect contrast sensitivity only. If it is significant, you can go for replacement of the graft. Interface fluid can occur in both LK as well as DSEC. If it is there in central and affecting visual acuity, you have to either drain it or you have to do a rebubbling in case of endothelial keratoplasty. Interface keratitis is there. It's difficult to treat because antibiotic cannot penetrate. You cannot take a sample. Most often you have to rely upon a therapeutic graft. Primary graft failure is usually seen in endothelial procedure, endothelial keratoplasty. Graft dislocation is also common in DMEC. If you want to read about this, you can follow any standard textbook, any review article. With this, I'll conclude my lecture. Thank you very much for your kind attention. And sorry for the extra time that I took.
Yeah, but then it was such a vast topic and very difficult to cover in 15 minutes, you know. So that's fine. Let's go to the next one. Next one.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Sharmila Devi.
So our next speaker is Dr. Sharmila Devi, ma'am. She is a senior assistant professor in cornea department at Rio, and she is also the editor-in-chief at Tamil Nadu Journal of Ophthalmic Sciences and Research. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Can I ask Dr. Praful to stop screen sharing, and start screen sharing? Good morning, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank Santosh sir for making me part of this session. So in this session, I'll take you through a spectrum of corneal diseases. It's a PG-centric talk. So I want all the postgraduates to have the differential diagnosis in their mind as and when I'm sharing the picture. So we'll start off with a very common case. Case 1 has circumcorneal congestion, a dry, dirty-looking central corneal ulcer with an elevated epithelial plaque surrounding corneal edema and a thick dome-shaped hyperpaeon. So many times we get all these cases of keratitis for exams, bacterial keratitis, fungal keratitis, and you can have mixed forms too. Many times we see the postgraduates starting off with an ocular examination and missing other findings. So what is important and what I would like to stress upon is you have to do a thorough ophthalmic evaluation. And whenever you see a case of keratitis, the 3 lines of defense should come to your mind. So you start up with the bony orbit, the lids and the lashes. So you look for proptosis, you look for entropion, ectropion, lag of thymus, myomitis. The second line of defense, the precorneal tearfil. You look for any ocular surface abnormalities. And the third line of defense, the corneal epithelium. So you look for any pathologies which can cause recurrent corneal erosions or it can be compromised the neurotrophic keratopathy. So the documentation has to be in this, the documentation has to be in this order. So even the negative findings have to be documented. Then only the examiner will know that you look for it. Suppose, even if there are no blisters, you have to document, you have to examine the face and say there is no evidence of any lesions of herpes zoster. That way the examiner will know that you've looked for it. And the grading of corneal ulcer has to be done methodically. And Dr. Deepti showed the ways to draw a corneal diagram. You should draw a proper corneal diagram with color coding. And these two features are very important, the depth of the infiltrate and the scleral involvement, because based on this, the treatment management, the management algorithm can change. Before going for exams, you should all be familiar with the MUT1 and 2 trial by Prashna Sir et al. So it's a mycotic ulcer treatment trial 1. It's an RCT comparing natamycin versus orokinosol. And it concluded that natamycin is superior to orokinosol in the treatment of filamentous fungal keratitis. It also said that orokinosol cannot be used as a monotherapy and it can be used only as a combination therapy in deep-seated keratitis. You should also be knowing about the MUT2 trial where they say that systemic antifungals have more use in endophthalmitis and scleral involvement. You should also know the TSD protocol by Namrata Sharma ma'am and others. So the paper gives you clear indications as to when to use a systemic antifungal drugs, topical targeted therapy like intracameral orokinosol and intrastromal orokinosol. So you should go through that. I'm sure you'll all be very familiar with the classification of fungus. This is what we are focusing on for keratitis, but you can have these causes too. Now you should also remember the non-septate filamentous fungi because mucormycosis is the in thing now, and mucorales belongs to non-septate filamentous fungi. It doesn't cause keratitis though. Pythium insidiosum was previously classified as fungus until it was discovered that that the cell membrane does not contain ergosterol. I would like to acknowledge Prajna sir for this picture in Payman. So you can see the characteristic features of Pythium keratitis in this. It's a full thickness corneal infiltrate. You can see tentacular projections and small pinpoint-like infiltrates, and an early limbal spread and peripheral gutter, which are very characteristic features of Pythium keratitis. So when do you suspect it? You treat the patient thinking it's fungal keratitis with antifungal drugs, and it doesn't respond, then you should think of Pythium keratitis. But if you pick it up early with these findings, maybe you can start the patient on linezolid and oral azithromycin. Coming to case 2, we have this case case 2 has an elevated conjunctival lesion. You have this papuliform type of lesion, which is encroaching onto the limbus and to the cornea. You can see some feeder vessels here. I'm sure you all have the diagnosis. It's ocular surface squamous neoplasia. So there can be different morphological variants. You can have leukoplakic variant where you have a hyperkeratinized epithelium, gelatinous, nodulo-ulcerative form, pigmented OSN. Now this pigmented OSN can be a differential diagnosis for melanoma also. And once we got a case where we thought it is pigmented OSN, I mean, it looked like that, dementatious fungi. Among certain pearls that I would like to stress upon is you have to delineate the lesion with rose bengal, gonioscopy has to be done, and regional lymph node examination has to be done because 15% of cases can have a local recurrence and they can have a lymph node metastasis. Imaging has to be done for this case along with the systemic workup. And anterior segment OCT is very essential to document the depth of the lesion. You can see the hyperreflective corneal epithelium, you can see the transition zone, you can see the stromal involvement. So it's very essential to document the depth of the involvement. Biopsy is the gold standard for diagnosis, and you can, it's an umbrella term. So you should be able to differentiate between a CIN, a carcinoma in situ. A carcinoma in situ, all the layers are involved, but then there is no breach in base membrane. And in invasive squamous carcinoma, you have a breach in the base membrane. So that's the basic difference. So after you've established the diagnosis, you should go about with the Shields no-touch technique. So what we do is in alcohol keratoepitelectomy, you mark the margins, 2 mm margin, 4 mm margin for the conjunctiva and tenons, do the conjunctiva tenonectomy, lamellar sclerectomy if it's a deep OSSM, 0.2 millimeters, and you have to do a double freeze thaw cryotherapy to prevent recurrence. And it's proven that this technique can actually prevent recurrence, and you cover the ocular surface with an amniotic membrane grafting. This is how you send it for a histopathological examination. You draw the diagram and you lay the tissue on the diagram. So the pathologist can give you whether the margins are positive or the margins are negative. In non-invasive, if it's a negative margin, you just need to follow it up. This is from Santosh Sir's paper in IGO. It's an old paper, but I think it still holds good. If there is a positive base, then you have to go for a plaque brachytherapy. And when do you use pre-op adjuvant chemotherapy like mitomycin or interferon alpha? When you have a visual axis involvement and when you have a huge lesion where you can have more than 6 clock hours of involvement. Then if you're going to remove the lesion, you will end up with a limbal stem cell deficiency. And that's when you use chemo reduction with topical mitomycin or interferon alpha. Coming to case 3, we have a case of limbal stem cell deficiency here. Now, why do we say it's limbal stem cell deficiency? You can see some corneal neovascularization. You can see some positive fluorescent staining. You can see the loss of clarity. So we say it's limbal stem cell deficiency. Now, what could be the cause? It is probably vernal keratoconjunctivitis. You can see the Horner-Trantas dots here. Essential to do evert the upper lid and document the palpable conjunctiva findings in this format. Hyperemia, swelling, follicle, papillae, giant papillae, how many papillae are there, and Horner-Trantas dots, how many dots are there. Essential to document in that way. Now, this is a case of VKC with severe limbal stem cell deficiency. We can have a spectrum of the disease. You can have a mild variant, a mild follicular reaction. You can have papillae, moderate papillae, giant papillae. You can have shield ulcers, and sometimes you can get infected also. So we use the step ladder approach for treating VKC. We can start off with mast cell stabilizers and then topical cyclosporin or tacrolimus. And this case wouldn't have gone for a limbal stem cell deficiency if the patient had been put on systemic steroids and topical tacrolimus or cyclosporin. So it's very essential to start systemic steroids, systemic immunosuppression in severe cases of VKC. Case 5, you have this is all sequelae of chemical injuries, again, limbal stem cell deficiency. But these are not acute cases. We have limbal stem cell deficiency. Again, you have loss of corneal clarity. You can have stromal opacities. You can see the lime deposits here. And this one is a severe symblepharon. So these are all sequelae of chemical injuries. All the postgraduates should be knowing the DeVas classification, the Ropahal classification thoroughly, and the management protocol for chemical injuries. And this case was a case of unilateral chemical injury where you can see the fibrovascular pannus and the symblepharon. So it is almost a near total limbal stem cell deficiency, but it was unilateral, and so we decided to go ahead with stem cell explants from the other eye. Thanks to Dr. Sangwan sir for this procedure. So you can see an auto sled being done for this case, and the cornea is clear after about 6 to 7 months. And if there is a bilateral chemical injury, then we need to do an alloslet with cadaveric stem cell explants. And those patients have to be put on immunosuppression before the treatment as well as after the treatment. Case 5, we have a limbal dermoid. You can see the whitish mass with sebaceous components. Now it's there in the infratemporal quadrant, which is supposed to be the more commonest location for dermoid. You can also see the sebaceous components. Now this is like grade 1 to grade 2 limbal dermoid because it's more than 5 millimeter, but it's not like it's just occupying 1/3 of the cornea. It's not more than 1/3 of the cornea. So when do we operate? So usually we treat it conservatively. You can remove the cilia, just give some symptomatic improvement, tear substitutes and glasses, because these children will definitely have astigmatism, but you have to measure the amount of astigmatism. And if it is more than 1.5 diopters, probably we have to take the patient for an excision biopsy with a lamellar patch graft. So this case, this was one ophthalmic image which we published, where you can see the preauricular attacks, the upper lip coloboma, situs inversus. It's basically an oculo-auriculovertebral dysplasia. It's a choristoma. Again, that question also is a favorite for examiners. We can leave the lamellar transplant like this, or we can, some surgeons tattoo it. I haven't been tattooing it. Case 6, you can see some crescent-shaped inflammation, almost 270 degrees, juxtalimbal cornea, and you can have adjacent episcleritis there. You can see 360-degree vascularization, thinning here, and iris tissue plugging the cornea. Now, it's very important to differentiate an infectious PUK from a non-infectious PUK. So the first investigation that you should do is a smear. Rule out infectious causes, because then the management protocol differs. You should always manage a case of PUK with a rheumatologist after doing a complete systemic evaluation. Another important question, which is a favorite question for examiners, is why is it more common in the periphery? And these are the reasons for it. You have immunoglobulin M more in the periphery cornea, Langerhans cells and antigen-presenting cells, neutrophils, lymphocytes, mast cells and plasma cells more in the periphery. You also have 5 times higher levels of C1 in the peripheral cornea. So the surgical management, we can do a conjunctival resection to buy time so that from the periphery, all these mediators do not come in. You can also do a lamellar patch graft or a sclerocorneal patch graft with amniotic membrane grafting and topical steroids or systemic steroids. For small sterile corneal perforations, we can even do a tuck and tenons. So we started doing tuck and tenons for small perforations, and it's been published in our Tamil Nadu journal. Case 7, I think Dr. Prafulla showed a lot of corneal dystrophies as well, where lamellar surgeries are being done. So these are all stromal dystrophies. You can see here breadcrumb-like deposits seen in the center of the cornea. So you have to see the periphery of the cornea. Sometimes you can even have a lamellar transplant. So you should look at the other eye. That's one thing that I would like to stress upon. Always examine the other eye, because the other eye can give you a clue. And you can also see the periphery also. So here it is clear, but in a macular dystrophy, the periphery is not very clear. And this is a lattice seen against retinal illumination. So you should always remember the mnemonic for deposits and stains and stromal dystrophies. Marilyn Monroe always gets her money in LACT. Why money instead of men? Because some examiners can be conservative. So you should remember this to remember about the deposits and the stains in stromal dystrophies. Case 8, this is just a corneal eye drops. You can see steep cornea with edematous cornea, steep cornea with edematous water collection, stromal edema. Anterior segment osity, there is a good paper by Sain Basu, sir, about the anterior segment osity findings in corneal eye drops. Whether there is a DM break which is rolled out, which is flat, or whether there is aqueous pockets in it. So you can see the stromal edema, gross stromal edema with aqueous pockets in it. And just to buy time, probably, and to prevent the symptoms, to give a symptomatic relief, you can probably do a corneal compression sutures with pneumodesmotopexy or intracameral C3F8. I'm done. So it can leave a scar, and it can gives a symptomatic relief, and that way you can postpone the keratoplasty. Thank you for your patient hearing. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I request the chairpersons to have a discussion regarding this talk, ma'am.
Is Dr. Basak saying something? Would you like to say something? Yeah, here I would just say that she has really given the whole cornea nutshell in 15 minutes, So all the different variety of cases, their presentation and possible histopath and what is typically which needs to be looked at, very nicely presented. Maybe let's put Yeah, let's go to the next discussion, next thing, and then we have a question which is waiting. So which we'll just take it after Dr. Sachdev.
Okay, sure, ma'am.
That is related to topography. So that question we can take it after Geetika.
Sure, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So our next speaker is Dr. Gitansha Sachdev, ma'am. She's the academic director and consultant at in cataract and refractive surgery at the Eye Foundation, and she's the youngest recipient of IIRSC Gold Medal for her achievements. She is a guest reviewer for various journals and the assistant editor of refractive surgery in IGM. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. A very good morning to all of you. So my talk today is on decision making in refractive surgery. Now let's begin with the basics. We'll start with the inclusion and the exclusion criteria. Age is an important parameter that one needs to consider. So we essentially wait for refractive stability before the patient can undergo any form of LVC. For a low to a moderate myopia, an age of 18 years would suffice. However, if it's a case of high myopia, I like waiting till about 20 to 21 years because the refractive error takes a little bit longer to stabilize. How to define stability? The refraction should be stable for at least a year, which means that the change in the MRAC should not be more than 0.25 diopters. Now, a lot of these patients will be wearing contact lenses, and the contact lens usage can affect the corneal tomography, which is one of the most important preoperative workups that you do in these cases. So the contact lenses should be discontinued for at least 5 days to a week for soft contact lenses and 2 weeks for RGB contact lenses. Corneal ectasia is an absolute contraindication for any form of LVC. See, you already have a weak cornea, and if you perform any form of laser vision correction, the cornea will get weaker further. The only option in these cases after stability of the cornea would be a phakic intraocular lens. Pregnancy and lactation can cause change in the corneal hydration status, because of which there can be fluctuations in the refractive error, and one should wait for systemic comorbidities like diabetes should be well controlled, because an uncontrolled diabetes can interfere with wound healing, especially in surface ablation procedures. Connective tissue disorders were initially considered as an absolute contraindication for refractive surgery. However, if it's a well-controlled disease on immunosuppressions, there's a healthy ocular surface, one can go ahead and perform a laser vision correction. Keloid formation is an important history that one must take. And if there's any history of keloid formation, surface ablation should not be done because it has an increased propensity for scar formation. Another thing about age that you can remember is if the patient is older, for example, nearing 38 or 39, you could perhaps plan for monovision, wherein the dominant eye is undercorrected. So you leave about 1.5 to 2 diopters of myopia, and the non-dominant eye is emmetropic or fully corrected. There are various ways to check for ocular dominance. One of the easiest is to point at a distant object with your finger, close one eye at a time, and see which eye you are using to view the object. Now, the workup begins with a good refraction because that's obviously what you're treating for the patient. A dilated fundus evaluation is very important because in a lot of these myopes, there can be an increased risk of any peripheral retinal degeneration, which has to be treated before the laser vision correction. Ocular adnexa and lid evaluation essentially includes checking for things like dresseritis, any NGB, treating them and making sure that the ocular surface is healthy. You have a good clear film. Corneal tomography and biomechanics has already been dealt with in detail, but I'll be covering it in the subsequent slides and giving you examples of how you select cases. So this is very brief. What is topography? It's essentially a study of the surface of the earth. So we're all aware, in school we used to do this where the plateaus were in yellow, the plains were in green, and the peaks were in red. Corneal topography is similar. It's a study of the surface of the cornea, and you get it as color-coded maps. The predecessors initially were keratometry, so in that only the central 3 mm of the cornea was assessed. But we had no information about the peripheral cornea, the posterior cornea, or the thickness. So with further understanding, we've realized that we don't need topography anymore. We need what is called tomography, which is not only the surface, but also the depth. So you also see the posterior cornea, which is very important because early ectasias start more in the posterior corneal surface as compared to the anterior cornea. And you see the thickness, which obviously is also a very important thing while planning the refractive surgery. So this has already been discussed. This is the quad map of the OBSCAN. You essentially have 4 important maps. There's a curvature map. They can be anywhere on the OBSCAN based on how you want them to show as a clinician. But there'll be 1 curvature map. There'll be 2 elevation maps, and there'll be a thickness or a pachymetry map. And in the center, there's additional data. Now we'll just deal with some of the abnormal findings or the ectasia indexes on the OBSCAN, wherein if you have any of these, the patient should ideally not undergo laser vision correction. So I'll deal with them one at a time. We'll begin with the curvature. The first thing that you look for is an asymmetric bow tie. So this is on the curvature map. You basically see this is a bow tie and it looks skewed or asymmetric. So this is because there is an irregular astigmatism in the case of ectasia. The other thing one looks for is the skew. A skew is nothing but the angle between these radial axes of the superior and the inferior hemimeridian. So if you extend this further, it subtends an angle with the inferior radius, and this angle or skew should not be more than 20 degrees. Another important thing that you look for is in the irregularity, which is in the center. So the irregularity in the 3 and the 5 mm zone should not be more than 1.5 and 2.5 diopters. Moving on to the elevation maps. The posterior Bestfit sphere, which is given here, should not be more than 55 diopters. And the highest point, which is on the elevation maps, the numbers are also given on the maps, should not be more than 50 microns above the BFS. Now, normally the ratio is around 1.2 because the anterior elevation is around 42 and the posterior is around 52. But in case of any ectatic disorder, like I mentioned earlier, the posterior cornea is involved first and the elevation increases. So this ratio of the posterior to the anterior BFS will become more. So anything more than 1.27 is considered as a red flag sign and one needs to avoid laser vision correction. Coming to the pachymetry or the thickness, it should not be less than 470 micron. And the thinnest reading should not be 30 microns thinner than the central reading. Now, both these thinnest and central readings are available on the tomography, and you can see that the difference should not be at more than 30. Sorry. Now, coming on to tomography or pentacam, there are different red flag signs which we'll go on to discuss. This is what the general quad map looks like. Again, it has the curvature, the elevations in the anterior and the posterior cornea, and the pachymetry. How the pentacam scores over the OBSCAN is that here the posterior cornea is actually, one actually measures it truly. It's not extrapolated from the anterior cornea like it is in the OBSCAN. So the data here is definitely more specific as compared to what you get on the earlier topography or the OBSCAN. Let's begin with the curvature maps. Here again, the things that you need to look for is that the maximum keratometry should not be more than 47.2. And the asymmetry between the superior and the inferior should not be more than 1.4. So on the left here, this what you see is a pristine cornea. You have a nice Buddha astigmatism. You can see that it's deeper vertically as compared to the horizontal meridia, no gross asymmetry, no excessive steepening. On the right, on the other hand, you can see that there's an excessive steepening and a great asymmetry between the superior and the inferior hemimeridian. Moving on to the pachymetry, on the left you see a normal cornea. On the right, what you see is that the thinnest pachymetry is inferiorly displaced from the corneal apex, and the difference between the two should be more than 10 microns for it to be a red flag sign. Moving on to the elevation maps, we have both the elevation maps on the anterior and posterior corneal surface. So what you look at is the 3 mm zone. This is not the 3 mm zone, this is the pupil. How you see the 3 mm zone is, you have 0 here and 4 here, this is 2. So 3 mm zone will vary from here till here on the cornea. So in the 3 mm zone, you look for an elevation point anything more than 12 on the anterior float and anything more than 16 on the posterior float is a red flag sign. So you can see this is a normal cornea, there's no excessive elevation. However, on the right, you have a case of ectasia wherein you can see elevated points on both the anterior and the posterior float. So whenever you see any of these red flag signs, you have to not do any keratorefractive procedure, which means you cannot treat on the cornea. You could do phakic intraocular lens implantations. If it's a borderline tomography, not yet going into the range of keratoconus. If it's a keratoconic eye, obviously you need to treat it accordingly and then give a refractive correction eventually. The benign ambrosia again has been discussed. So all you look for at the end is the overall D. This is an overall D of red, which is a cross red flag sign, and the patient should not undergo laser vision correction. Now, assuming you ruled out all the red flag signs, the corneal tomographies are normal. What are the choices that you have at hand? Start with surface ablation. We can do a LASIK, which can either be with a blade or a microkeratome, or with a femtosecond laser. The next option would be a SMILE. This, however, does not work yet for hyperopia. It is not commercially available. Phakic intraocular lenses and combinations with CSF. So I'll begin with a gross overview, and then we see certain case examples. So the main parameters that you have to see here is the spherical equivalent and the tomographic parameters, which mainly include the keratometry and the pachymetry. Now, assuming the patient is of age, has a refractive stability, you ask for history of contact lens wear. The patient is wearing contact lenses, again, you make them stop. I have already discussed the timelines. If no, you go ahead with a corneal tomography. If it's normal, we can do an LVC. If it's abnormal, no laser vision correction. Now, when the corneal tomography is normal, one of the major things that you see is the corneal pachymetry. If it's less than 475 microns on the thinnest corneal pachymetry, the option would be to leave the cornea alone and implant a phakic intraocular lens. Moving on to 475 microns or more. These are rough guidelines. It could be around 470 to 475 and around 490 to 500, but this is what we use. So between 475 to 500 microns, surface ablation would be preferred. If it's more than 500 microns, you see what the residual bed will be. Now the residual bed is nothing but what you leave behind untouched. So if you're doing a SMILE, you take a cap and then you remove a lenticule. If you're doing a LASIK, you make a flap and then you do an ablation. So after all of this, whatever is left behind, you calculate, and it should be more than 280 to 290 microns. If it's more than it, you go ahead with your keratorefractive procedures. If it's less than 280, again, leave the cornea alone and implant a phakic intraocular lens. Now let's do certain examples wherein one option might be preferred over the other. So this is the corneal curvature. Let me see this video. This is what is called a relatively flat cornea. When you normally discuss corneal curvatures, the average range is around 42 to 46 microns. Now, anything less than 42 is a flatter cornea. Here you can see it's around 40.7, 41. And anything more than 47 is a steeper cornea. Now, flatter corneas on the microkeratome have an increased propensity for what is known as a free flap, which is what you can see here. So the entire flap has come out in toto. There's no hinge left behind to anchor the flap to the underlying stroma. So in these cases, it would be preferable to either do a femtosecond laser, because the femtolaser is independent of the corneal curvature. It will give you a precise flap nonetheless. If the patient cannot afford it, then maybe you could go for surface ablation because it's a cheaper alternative. But it's better to avoid a microkeratome in such flat corneas. The other extreme is a steep cornea, anything more than 47, 47.5. These are more prone for buttonholes on the microkeratome, and again, the blade should be avoided. An important thing that one should look out for is corneal opacities. Now, corneal opacities, especially dense ones, one should avoid the femtosecond laser, because this laser you'll see now can actually break through the area of the opacity and breach into the epithelium. This is a peripheral one, so we've actually gone ahead with the procedure, but if it's central, you actually cannot continue the procedure. So the important things that you need to do is to carefully first not miss out such opacities. The second is to assess the depth of the scar. If it's a very subtle opacity, which is very superficial, you can always go in for a deeper flap with a femtosecond laser. However, if that's not possible, the other options would be to go for a blade LASIK or to do a surface ablation. Now let's talk about some other extremes. What about a very thin CCT? So you can see here the patient, otherwise the corneal tomographies are perfectly normal, has a stable refractive error, but the cornea is thin. It's around 444 microns. And the Benin Ambrosio is yellow here, essentially because the cornea is very thin. So in such a case, like I've mentioned earlier, because it's less than 475, you will not do any procedure on the cornea and you will plan a phakic intraocular lens. What about high refractive errors? Now, this is the case of around 10.5 diopters spherical equivalent. You can see that the corneas have enough thickness. It's around 528 here and 517 here. So what do we do? Let's discuss, calculate what the residual stromal bed will be. Now, if you're doing a femtosecond LASIK, the flap here is 90 microns. The calculated ablation you can do when you enter in the machine, it's showing 128 microns. So the residual stromal bed that you have here is beyond 280 microns, it's 306. So do you think we can go ahead with the femtosecond LASIK? BRK is not an option here because it's too high an error and there will be a very high risk of regression. Microkeratones could have been done, but the flap would be much thicker. It would be around 110 to 120 microns. So the residual stromal bed would then become lower. There's another important thing that you need to remember. It's called a PTA, which is the percentage of tissue altered, which is nothing but essentially the tissue that you're altering. So it's the flap that you're making, the flap thickness, and the ablation divided by the total corneal thickness. It has to be less than 40%. So coming back to the same case, if you take 90 micron flap with the ablation depth and divided by the corneal thickness, you're actually doing a PTA of more than 40. So in these cases, it is better not to do anything on the cornea and a phakic intraocular lens would be preferred. This is the last case. It's another extreme of a high hyperopia. High hyperopias don't do really well with surface ablation. There's a high risk of regression or LASIK, and SMILE, like I've said, as of now is not commercially available for high hyperopia. The other problem here is you would want to implant a phakic intraocular lens, but high hyperopes normally are smaller eyes. So very often the anterior chamber depth is not adequate for a phakic intraocular lens implantation. You need a minimum of 2.8. So you can see here the patient has a high hyperopia, but the anterior chamber is just not large enough to do a phakic IOL. So what we've done here is a clear lens extraction, but you can see that the IOL power here is around 39 in one eye and 49 in the other. The maximum commercially available lenses that you get, especially with the Technis, which is the maximum, would be around 40 diopters. So after doing that, the right eye was almost emmetropic, but the left eye still had a large amount of refractive error left. The other options in this would be to do a piggyback IOL. We use the Sulcoflex. So this is a lens which sits on top of another lens in the sulcus. So this can be used in highly hyperopic eyes. It's a single piece lens. This has a 6.5 millimeter optic. It has large undulating haptics which let it fit very snugly without support. There's a posterior angulation at this junction. That's essentially done so this lens is slightly forward and is not in contact with the lens behind. So there's no interlenticular opacity. And this is hydrophilic as against the hydrophobic lens that you will have implanted after the clear lens exchange. The IOL power calculation here is very easy. You have the Holiday and the Gales. Holiday is for 1:1 for a myopic correction, which means if you have one diopter of myopia on refraction, you give a 1 diopter Sulcoflex. Hyperopic is the Gills formula, which is roughly around 1.5 times. So I think I've finished my 15 minutes. So I just like to conclude that with a thorough clinical examination and a very good understanding of the corneal tomography, you could go ahead with absolutely no issues. There is a careful case selection involved in certain extreme cases, like the ones I've discussed, wherein one procedure may be preferred over the other, even though the corneal tomography looks normal. Thank you.
I think, thank you, Gidansha. You really summarized the whole thing very well. And given the adequate knowledge of red flags, so what would be your option for a patient who's not fit for refractive surgery, even say, let's say a myope also, but an AC depth is less than 2.8? You've already covered it in a hyperope, but a myope -5, -6, and AC depth is also not so good.
So basically, I would go till about 2.7. if the AC depth is up to about 2.7, the patient could undergo a phakic intraocular lens implantation. I am not a believer of a clear lens extraction in a high myo, especially before the age of 40, where the PVD has not been completely induced and the risk of retinal detachment is much greater. There have been multiple Cochrane reviews which show that the risk of RD following phakic IOL in multiple papers ranges from around 2% to about as high as 8%. So I would just tell the patient not to undergo laser vision correction, just wear contact lenses or spectacles, whatever.
That's right. That's right. So that's what we'd like to take it. Thank you. There was a question in the chat box where the gentleman has asked about, if you only could summarize, what is Berlin Ambrosio display?
Okay, just show you the presentation so it will be easier.
I think we have 5 minutes, so we can do it in that. Yeah.
Is it visible? I can't see it.
Yes, the screen is visible.
I'm somehow not able to see my own screen. Just a moment. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm just opening the.
This slide is already there.
Oh yeah, wonderful. If you don't full screen. So
Right.
the Berlin Ambrosio is nothing but. I'm sorry, I was in another session, so I missed Pooja's talk. I don't know how much he's covered, so I just.
We didn't cover about bad, so
Okay.
maybe you can.
So I'll just start. So essentially, there's something known as a Bestwitz sphere, which is a combination of all the points of the cornea of a particular diameter. We normally take around 8 millimeters, right? Why we take 8 is if you take a much larger one, you'll end up including the peripheral cornea, and the Bestwitz sphere will become flatter. If you take a shorter BFS, you'll end up taking more of the central cornea, which is steeper, and the Bestwitz sphere will become steeper. So the Bestwitz sphere is nothing but a total average of 8 millimeters. So it's like taking the sea level. You imagine the sea, you imagine a mountain, and you imagine a pit. The Bestwitz sphere, for example, if it's a sea, anything lower than that, or the pit will show as a depression, and anything higher than that, like a mountain, will show as an elevation. So now you have a BFS of whatever value on the cornea. All points steeper than that will be an elevation, and all points which are not steeper than that will be depressions. So we need to look for steeper points because that's what happens in keratoconus or ectasia. The cornea undergoes a steepening, right? So I've already shown this comes on the float or the elevation maps. So I've already discussed that you have elevation maps of both the anterior and the posterior surface. So this is what you have on the quad map as well. These are the elevation maps. Then what you do is you exclude 3 millimeters from the center of the cornea. So now you're calculating a new BFS wherein you've excluded the central 3 millimeters, which are obviously the steepest 3 millimeters. So what you're left behind with is a slightly flatter BFS. So what will happen here is now, if the cornea is still normal and you're still flattening the BFS, there will not be extra areas of elevation in the central 3 millimeter zone. However, if it's a case of keratoconus, which has an increased elevation, and you've removed the central 3 millimeters, you'll be able to see these difference areas in the center. So what you get at the end is the difference map. So this is the regular BFS with 8 millimeter diameter. Then you exclude 3 millimeters of the central cornea, excluding the more steep points, getting a flatter BFS, because of which these steeper points will now show more. And what is shown here is the difference map. So you look at the difference. Green means it's normal. There's nothing abnormal. This is slightly borderline, and this is a red flag sign. So difference of more than 7 microns here, like here, is a major red flag sign. And on the posterior cornea, if the difference is more than 16 microns. So this is one of the major parts. This is on the elevation. This is the same thing which comes here as the front and the back. Now these three are to do with the thickness. Okay. So thickness you can have as CTSP and as the PTI. So this is nothing but the corneal thickness in all the 4 hemimeridia, which you can see here. So it takes superior, inferior, nasal and temporal, and it shows how the cornea continues to progress in terms of thickness in relation to the center. So this is the thickness spatial profile, which shows that, okay, in the center, it started here at 500, and then it's as you're going down to the 2 millimeter, the 4 millimeter, the thickness is continuing to change. The percentage of thickness increase is similar, but it's the same thing calculated as a percentage. So again, this is plotted by the machine as such. So you have to see both these curves and they have to fall within the 2 standard deviations. This is normal. So you're seeing that the way the thickness profile is going on all 4 meridii from center to outwards in terms of the thickness and the percentage are normal. However, here you see that there is a variation. This is an abnormality. These are seen as the pachymetry. The thickness changes, and this is the axial displacement. Like I mentioned before, the thinnest point axially displaces inferiorly in a keratoconic eye. So all 5 of these are then put together by the machine itself. You don't
apologizing to all the doctors to please sum it up because it's about 12 a.m., 12 p.m. and we are about to start.
Finished.
So this is the overall D, and this is the other thing that you need to see on the Bell and Ambrose domain. That's about it.
Thank you, Gitansha. So in nutshell, the advantage of BAD is whenever you have a suspicious looking cornea, when you're not very sure of whether it's a keratoconus or not, you like to use BAD so that it highlights that particular area. Thank you. Thank you all the speakers for carrying on this wonderful cornea.
Thank you so much to all the chairpersons for chairing this session, and thank you all the speakers for being such an informative in this session.